In 2017, MEI has intensified its already considerable programming and publishing about Iran and the Gulf states. The Gulf Affairs Program launched last year and aims to enhance U.S. understanding of the major issues and opportunities confronting the 6 members of the Gulf Cooperation Council, Yemen, Iraq, and Iran. Our Iran Observe project is making a unique contribution to the public's understanding of Iran by providing in English every weekday reporting and analysis of the most important Farsi language public statements, news reports, press releases, and tweets issued by Iran's leadership and other influential personalities. In addition, MEI scholars Alex Vitanka, Ahmed Majidiar, and others have been writing prodigiously for print and electronic journals and for our own website. In keeping with these efforts, we conceived of today's conference to delve more deeply into the many issues surrounding Iran, its goals and objectives in the region, and the U.S. response. There's broad agreement in the United States that Tehran's acquisition of a nuclear weapon would pose a grave danger to regional and global security and stability. But there's also a broad bipartisan consensus that Iran's projection of conventional power and political influence in the broader Middle East is a destabilizing factor running counter to U.S. regional interests. Our goal today is to put the right questions on the table for our assembled experts and hopefully to arrive at some of the answers. Should the U.S. pursue a policy of active confrontation with Iran on all fronts, or are we better served by seeking to balance military coercion, selective sanctions, diplomacy, and on a case-by-case basis, deconfliction or even engagement? How do we measure success? We hope when we leave here this afternoon that we'll have a better sense of the answers to these core questions. So without further ado, let me hand over the microphone to our first panel, moderated by our very own Dr. Paul Salem. Thank you.
Thank you, Jerry, and thank you all for coming. I'm clearly not Karun Demirjian, who was supposed to moderate this panel. Karun is a defense and foreign policy journalist at the Washington Post, but she too is down in the Senate covering the votes with Senator Coons and couldn't make it after we changed our schedule. This first panel looks at or tries to assess the actual threat in terms of Iran's approach to its foreign policy, both regionally and internationally, its military and paramilitary strategy and tactics and deployments, and to what degree is the U.S. Comprehending the complexity of those dynamics and shaping a strategy that is commensurate and appropriate for it. We have 3 excellent panelists. I'll introduce them briefly. To my far right is Dr. Suzanne Maloney. She's the Deputy Director of the Foreign Policy Program at the Brookings Institution and a Senior Fellow there for Middle East Policy and Energy Security and Climate Initiative. She's written extensively on Iran as well as other issues in the region. Previously to her engagement with Brookings, she was an external advisor to the State Department on issues relating to Iran, served on the Secretary of State's Foreign Policy Planning Staff, and was the director of the 2004 Council on Foreign Relations Task Force on U.S. policy towards Iran. To my left is Dr. Anthony Cordesman, who's the Arleigh Burke Chair in Strategy at CSIS. I'm sure known to many of you, written extensively on U.S. security policy, energy, and Middle East policy. He's been a consultant to the Departments of State and Defense during the Afghan and Iraq wars, served with Senator John McCain on the Senate Armed Services Committee as a national security advisor, and was Director of Intelligence Assessment in the Office of the Secretary of Defense. Has received the Distinguished Service Medal from the Department of Defense and has also been an adjunct professor at Georgetown University. To my immediate right is Admiral James Winnefeld. retired from the US Navy, served until July 2015 as the 9th Vice Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. During his career in uniform, Admiral Winnefeld served as commander of the US Northern Command and commander of the North American Aerospace Defense Command. He currently sits on the board of directors at the Raytheon Company and is a non-resident senior fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School's Belfer Center and a distinguished professor at the Sam Nunn School of International Affairs at Georgia Tech. So an extremely distinguished panel. Dr. Maloney, let me start with you. If you can give us your view of, or your assessment of how Iranian decision makers see their goals and their interests and how that translates into their strategies, their deployments, vis-a-vis the Middle East, but also vis-a-vis the US.
Thank you very much, Paul, and thanks so much to the Middle East Institute for organizing this discussion today. It's a really rich agenda with a lot of very impressive people who will come after me. So I will speak relatively briefly and also hope for a robust discussion. I think I want to start with the kind of core element of the Iranian strategic worldview, and that is one of realpolitik. We have a tendency to view Iran's perspective on the world through rhetoric, which is often highly exuberant and extremely expressive in terms of the characterizations of its aims and goals. And it can be tempting to permit the curiosity of the way Iranian leaders express their goals and interests to overwhelm what is a clear pattern over the course of the past 38 years, that Iran has a core set of national interests, that it seeks to pursue them with some degree of consistency and pragmatism, and that in fact Iran is susceptible to a kind of rational cost-benefit analysis in terms of its motivations and its deliberations in the region. But I also wanted to highlight very briefly 5 other factors that feed into the way that Iran sees both threats and opportunities across the region in particular. The first is the kind of imperial legacy that infuses Iran's sense of identity. Even within the Islamic Republic, there is a clear awareness of the long history of political cohesion, territorial integrity, and the role that Iran has played for millennia in terms of both military but also cultural influence across the broader Middle East. And so this remains an important factor in terms of Iran's sense of place, its struggle, its assertion of its own primacy within the region. Secondarily, I'd cite Islam intertwined with Shia Islam. Iran would prefer to be a non-sectarian power. It is inevitably, identifiably a sectarian power. But it is an inherent function of the revolution, which was both in terms of theme, in terms of opportunity, in terms of mobilization, was affected via religious institutions and leaders, and a state which remains very much intertwined with religious institutions and leadership. It is clear that religious goals and agendas do at times play into the way that Iran sees the world, the way that it projects its power across the region. And this is, I think, something that we shouldn't simply set aside because there is also a realpolitik dimension. Third, I want to cite a kind of enduring factor in Iran's perceptions of itself in the world, and that is this kind of resentment of foreign influence, a kind of anti-imperialism that was also a fundamental core theme of the revolution and of the state that was forged in its aftermath. Again, it's easy to sort of conflate Iran as an Islamic republic with a pure theocracy. It is not, as I'm sure you're all well aware. But in fact, leftist organizations and ideologies played an important role, often fused with a kind of religious perspective in the way that the state was structured and in the sorts of perceptions of the world and views of both threats and opportunities that its leadership continues to see. And so this kind of deep-seated antipathy toward the machinations of great powers comes out of a long history and perspective of Iran as kind of the plaything of imperial overlords with rapacious intent. And it's still very much, if you kind of sort through both the rhetoric and the way Iran has approached great international powers, whether it's the United States or the Soviet Union, now Russia, as well as its own dynamics within the region. Fourth factor is domestic politics. This was, of course, initially a point of weakness after the revolution, the purges and the chaos that existed in the early years of the Islamic Republic made the Iranian state vulnerable to the Iraqi incursion and to other domestic threats. But I think domestic politics, paradoxically, has sort of emerged as a point of strength for the Islamic Republic in the way that it frames its approach to the world. It's generated coherent and well-resourced institutions. It's generated a kind of political sphere with a certain degree of legitimacy. And of course, it has resulted in the elevation and ascendance, both in military terms, but also in terms of domestic security and the domestic economy of the Revolutionary Guard. Finally, I want to speak to what I think is ultimately the most important factor when it comes to the Iranian leadership, and that is the perception of regime security. And the way that the various threats are perceived is very much through this lens of a conviction that the world is implacably aligned against Iran, that the threat of an organization like the Taliban a decade or two ago, or the Islamic State today, is not purely a sort of threat that emerges from ungoverned territories and lack of opportunity and extremist ideologies, but in fact a deliberately orchestrated conspiracy to try to create disorder within the broader world of Islam, and specifically to try to undermine and ideally oust the Islamic Republic of Iran. And this sense of conspiratorial intent, of course, is directed most specifically at the United States via what is seen as the proxy role of regional powers, particularly Saudi Arabia in most recent light. And I think that that inevitably is a critical dimension of the way that Iran has formulated its strategic doctrine. There has been, at least since the early days and the kind of consolidation of the post-revolutionary state and security bureaucracy, a presumption that the best defense is a good offense, that compromise is akin or will be read and interpreted as an invitation to greater pressure. And so Iran tends to counterattack rather than conciliate. Iran tends to see strength in outreach and intervention rather than in a more insular approach. Finally, I just want to speak to a couple of key issues that I think you'll hear more about over the course of the day in terms of the kind of evolution in the way that we're seeing some of these factors play out in Iran's regional and foreign policy. The first, and I saw Matt McGinnis in the back of the room somewhere. I know he's speaking later, and we'll speak to this in greater depth. But what has happened is, I think almost unnoticed, at least in much of the pundit class in Washington, is a real sea change in the way that Iran conducts its regional interventions. A shift from a reliance on asymmetric tools of foreign policy to one that is much more an expeditionary force and exposes Iran, I think, to much greater expectations and obligations in terms of its long-term role in post-conflict societies, but also the perception that has clearly been generated among many of its neighbors that Iran has now become an imperialist power rather than an anti-status quo power. These are very different sorts of things. The other issue I wanted to point to is the increasing and depth and importance of the strategic partnership that has been developed between Iran and Russia. And finally, I think what we're seeing today, what we've seen really come to the fore over the course of the past several months, is a full-fledged struggle for primacy between Iran and its neighbors. This has always been, to some extent, the case. It's been a fluid balance of power, at least since the British left the Middle East. But in many ways, I think the sort of assertiveness and effort to impose strategic discipline that has been exerted by Mohammed bin Salman and the Saudis over the course of recent weeks suggests a new willingness on the part of at least one Arab player to take on the Iranians directly and head on, to try to contest rather than contain Iran's apparent ascendance across the region. And I think that has serious risks of escalation, and look forward to greater discussion around all these issues. Thanks.
Thank you, Suzanne. Let me follow up with a couple of questions. The first is, does the president matter? President Rouhani and his team and the people who voted for him and so on. Does he matter in foreign policy, whether it's towards the Middle East or international, in terms of everything you talked about? Secondly, you started off saying that they have a sort of a realpolitik. They may be the Revolutionary Guards more specifically, but then you listed a number of factors which maybe are not so much realpolitik, an imperial kind of maybe instinct, an Islamic Shiaist, some kind of ambition or millenarianism, a strong resentment against imperial powers and so on, domestic politics and regime security. So I guess my question is, maybe I understand that as their approach is very power-centric, they respect power and they use power in different ways, but within the Revolutionary Guard set of interventions, whether it's Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Yemen, and other places, as well as their sort of missile and military buildup, what is sort of the regional endpoint that they're trying to get to? Is it a set of undermined states with militias that they control? Is it getting to a Westphalian system, which doesn't seem to be the case? What is the context within which their ambitions make sense to them? And it seems to be a very disruptive vision that they have.
Those are both really interesting questions, and I look forward to hearing others' views on both those issues. I would say the first is a little easier. The question of the presidency absolutely matters. I mean, think back to the kind of context for U.S. policymaking toward Iran during the Ahmadinejad administration. It's a very different sort of set of opportunities for a U.S. administration in terms of creating an international coalition to, or even any kind of consensus around the problem posed by Iran. So the president matters in terms of the kind of symbolic nature and the cast that is put upon Iran's strategic behavior. But it also, clearly Rouhani matters, and each of his predecessors has mattered to greater and lesser extent in terms of actual decision making. I think of any of the past three presidents, Rouhani is best positioned to play a significant role. He spent more than a decade as the secretary of Iran's National Security Commission, which is equivalent to playing the role of national security advisor in obviously a very different system. But he was part and parcel of every security decision that was made, essentially from the end of the war in Iraq up until the Ahmadinejad presidency, when he was largely pushed to the side. And so he has both a kind of investment in perception and institutional memory around these, but he also has the relationships with all of the members of the leadership of the security bureaucracy. This is not a man who's out of touch with the Revolutionary Guard. He's obviously out of sorts to some extent in terms of the relationship, but he is someone who is well known to them and they're well known to him. And so he clearly plays a role. You asked whether the people who voted for him play a role in national security decision making. I think that's far more obscure and far less meaningful, as it typically is in even a much more robust democracy. Our leaders are often making decisions that are not necessarily wholly in tune with the preferences of their population. But within Iran, clearly, there is no real mechanism for popular input or influence over foreign policy or national security decision making. In terms of the context and what Iran would like to see, I think that has been, in many ways, evolutionary. Iran is, the realpolitik that I spoke of, I think, is primarily opportunistic, that Iran is capable of retrenching when necessary, but where there are opportunities, even where they are heavily laden with risk, Iran is prepared and in fact inclined to move toward those opportunities and to try to exploit and take advantage of them. I don't think there is a single Westphalian left in the Middle East today, maybe in Jordan, I don't know. But I think the outcome that Iran is striving for today is wide as influence as possible, which is a kind of perennial goal. But clearly also to establish a kind of different relationship and a different future for Syria than any of Syria's neighbors, other neighbors, or than Syrians themselves would like to see.
Thank you very, very much. Dr. Cordesman, let me turn to you. Give us maybe a sense of what are the realities of the Iranian, military and paramilitary structures. What is the nature of that threat? Is it defensive, offensive? How do you see it? And in terms of Iran's neighbors, particularly in the Gulf, to what degree are they able to counterbalance or establish a balance? And whether the current GCC crisis relates to all of this vis-a-vis Iran. Your thoughts?
I would add to the comments we've already heard on Iran that you need to understand that Iran has had all of these postures since the time of the Shah, and when I was at the embassy in Iran in 1970 to 73. It also is a nation still largely dependent on many of the weapons systems that were being delivered back then, or that I was working on as projects which were delivered several years later. And weapon systems in general age in dog years. They are not something that you wish to keep around from the Vietnam era. The idea of Iran as a conventional superpower requires an awful lot of strategic illiteracy. It simply is not close to being a major power in that sense. I think the point's already been made, but it's an important one. They have a very realistic picture of the risks, of the cost of what happened in the Iran-Iraq war, of what happened in the tanker war, and our capabilities and how they've changed since. They have seen what we did in 2003, and they have seen us adapt significantly in our tactics and support of other states. So in that sense, I think you are talking about people who know how to use the politics of military rhetoric, but also have a realistic understanding. It is a divided force structure. They are pursuing a missile development program. It is making very serious progress, including in solid state, and particularly in precision guidance, that can give their conventional warheads effectiveness against point targets, infrastructure, and military for the first time. They're several years away from success, but this will be the first time that they have had significant offensive capability in a long time. It's not a military force organized to project power on land or sea outside Iran in the conventional sense. The JCPOA has deprived them of most of their near-term nuclear capabilities. There is a certain amount of indifference from both its supporters and opponents to how much nuclear work you can do under the terms of that agreement by way of developing a long-term breakout capability, but it's not the kind of thing that leads to sudden or quick surprises. Their asymmetric capabilities in the Gulf are a combination of missile, ship, and air capabilities. They are limited, but they are certainly highly effective over time against shipping, tanker movements, and a threat to naval groupings. They are not things that you can easily cope with. There is no capability as yet to deal with smart mines, for example. And these are a very real threat if what you want is spoiler or harassment types of conflicts. I think I would disagree in one sense with the previous speaker. I think it is very easy to walk away from spoiler or limited operations if you want to. You may not want to, but they aren't really morasses except in self-inflicted terms. There's always another spoiler operation after the one you're in, if that's all you want. And that makes things like the Al-Quds Force, train and assist, the use of proxies, an easy tool for Iran. It doesn't have to stay, and it doesn't have to occupy. But about Iran's overall weakness, it's a country that has a GDP about 1.5 trillion. That's for 82 million people. its per capita income is remarkably low by the standards of the region. It's about 16,000. Saudi Arabia alone has a GDP of 1.7 trillion for 28 million people and a per capita income of around $54,000. In spite of all the talk about increased revenues, the latest estimates from the Department of Energy are that the cuts in oil prices dropped Iran's oil revenues from $99 billion a year in 2012 to $29.4 billion in 2015, and they've only risen to about $36 billion in spite of limited relief. I think, to put this in a somewhat different perspective, if you look only at the Gulf states, they're spending about $91 billion on military forces this year. Iran is probably going to be spending about $16 billion. If you look at arms deliveries because of sanctions, boycotts, political problems, a declassified estimate from the US Department of Defense puts Iran's total arm deliveries in 2012 to 2015 at about $100 million, and its new sales at about $600 million. To put this in perspective, the GCC took delivery on over $30 billion, and the sales were $84 billion. And Iran, while it has done some very good work in modifying equipment, updating, providing workarounds, the limits in its aging sort of military structures, frankly has done very poorly in overall military production. Once you cut through what are often, let's put it bluntly, lies, its actual military production of modern hardware has been very limited, and often those systems have shown poor development and poor systems integration. A little more critical reporting wouldn't do anybody any harm in these areas. It would take them years to acquire a modern Air Force, a modern Navy. It will take them at least several years to integrate the S-300 into their actual air defenses, and they will still be grossly overdependent on Vietnam-era systems. A lot of that armor, again, dates back to my time in Iran, and that time was some time ago. And then we come to the Arab Gulf, then to the Gulf Cooperation Council. Well, the good news is that the United States has immense military capability. It has great experience in operating out of bases in the Gulf. We are forward deployed. We have substantial pre-positioning. And we can provide the ability to integrate most of the Gulf forces, particularly the more effective forces, Saudi Arabia and the UAE, into naval and air operations. And because of the way that they have bought equipment, which has been a combination of focusing on the glitter factor and the kind of toys for the boys approach to weapons purchasing, they have a lot of actual weapons and very poor ISR, battle management, communications capabilities. Poor individually in given countries, as the Yemen War has demonstrated, much poorer when it comes to actually operating as an alliance. Now, I was just asked to describe how the Gulf forces work together. And let me preface this with the fact you have some really excellent military elements in the Gulf. You have a lot of outstanding young officers. You've developed some really good civilian analysts. Your problems tend to be at the top, at the level of national divisions between countries and the tendency to focus far too much on buying weapons rather than real integrated military capability. So how do you put this into perspective? Well, I think most of you are familiar in some way with the American television show, The Game of Thrones. So how would this Game of Thrones be described? Well, first, there's no sex. Second, there's no actual violence. 3, there really aren't any interesting conspiracies. And one of the most critical defects is that you have no prince that is equivalent to either the scheming eunuch or the brilliant dwarf. You have a basic gap in leadership quality, and it is extraordinarily wasteful. I gave you some of those numbers just a moment ago. Frankly, you have an unaffordable force posture in a number of Gulf states. Oman is reported as spending 15% of its GDP on military forces. None of us can figure out exactly where the money is actually going. Certainly not to the level of modernization that would imply. Saudi Arabia is spending something on the order of 9%. Remember that NATO has trouble with 2%. Before the oil crisis, it spent nearly 13%. Its total defense budget is roughly equal to that of Russia. And for a country with the 2030 plan, that is an inherently fatal approach to defense spending. The UAE is less wasteful and more efficient, but it's spending more than Iran on defense. And its GDP is still close to 4%. Other countries all greatly exceed the levels we expect out of our NATO allies. And given a 50% cut in oil revenues, these are not things that countries under intense population and development pressure can really afford. People may talk about what a good thing it is to have $100 billion in arms orders. Well, if you want stability and development, and you already have a vast military lead, it is not a good thing. Not good for the countries, not good for the United States, and certainly not good for the people involved. What you have, too, is the hollow shell of an alliance. Any of you who have listened to the vacuous rhetoric you get in places like the Manama Dialogue get a pretty good idea of just how empty a lot of the planning is. There really aren't any institutions, even to match a relatively limited alliance like NATO. Interoperability is poor, standardization is poor. There is a general tendency to ignore many of the mission priorities that the US has pushed for, like naval modernization in key selected areas. A long focus on the glitter factor in areas like missile defense, very poor air defense integration, a lot of which is a hollow shell when it should be effective, poor offensive planning, which we've seen demonstrated and become reliance on us. The war in Yemen is a warning that a lot more should have been done decades ago. And having watched this since 1980, let me say, time and again I have heard the right priorities from the Gulf militaries and the wrong priorities from their ministers of defense. I would just say, in terms of Qatar, the UAE, and Saudi Arabia, this isn't new. And we have had decades of paralysis in trying to link Oman more broadly into the rest of the Gulf. We've had case after case where some minister or senior officer ended up throwing vast amounts of money in the wrong direction in a given country. Now, to be blunt, a certain amount of princely ass-kissing is inevitable in discussing the Gulf. But there's been a lot too much of it. People have been flattered for making the wrong decisions, and in part because a lot of those wrong decisions have been very profitable to us, at least in selling arms. And this particular episode simply borders on the childish. I have the hope that Secretary Tillerson's compromise will succeed. I have the hope that people will recognize that some of the complaints about Qatar's support of extremism were perfectly valid, but that as part of the compromise he has proposed, some of the countries involved that criticize Qatar will also take more steps to deal with their support of extremism. If there's any mantra that you could issue about the Gulf Cooperation Council at this point in time, it is that a number of princes may have reached adulthood, but it is time for them to grow up.
Thank you, Dr. Cordesman. Thanks a lot. Let me ask a couple of follow-up questions. You sort of describe Iran as maybe an overinflated tiger, whether paper tiger or whatnot, that much more overblown than it actually is. But at the same time, it has been able to project some forms of power in Syria, and Lebanon, and Iraq, attempts in Yemen, in a way more effectively than others in the region, maybe in less costly ways, less conventional ways. But within that context, and linking a bit to what Dr. Maloney was talking about, how do you see Iran's sort of security strategy? You sort of hinted that they're good at spoiling, at disrupting, not good at sort of real power projection and so on. Looking at Iran and where it's investing and what it's doing, how do you understand their national security goals? And then on the, whether it's the GCC side or GCC US side, why is it that neither the GCC nor the US have been very effective in containing or pushing back Iran where it has succeeded in deploying, given that it's not that formidable, in some sense, is not that formidable a foe? What are we or they doing wrong, other than being somewhat of a hollow shell, as you said, in the GCC?
I hope the distinction, well, I should have hoped it would be clear. I talked about Iran's conventional military capabilities as being limited. I also pointed out that they had other capabilities, asymmetric, the ability to project, train, and assist missions like the Al-Quds Force, a focus on missile structures and asymmetric forces that they had done quite well. And I think we need to parse out Iran's capabilities. What I see in a lot of reporting is some very careless terminology and a tendency to describe Iran, in some cases, my favorite was the superpower of the Gulf, which probably implied that we had suddenly withdrawn from the Gulf and no longer had any capabilities left in it. These are different capabilities, and Iran does some things very well. I think, too, that when you talk about strategy, Iran has put immense efforts into creating defensive capabilities. I think some of the pressure for that is off, but the changes in its local defense forces, its idea of absorbing invasion and attack, its focus on air defense, its willingness to create a threat to the Gulf, which would affect shipping and potentially create the ability to conduct a significant war of attrition. These have significant defensive capabilities. When it comes down to projecting power, I mentioned the train and assist, the Al-Quds Force. They have certainly learned how to export limited types of weapons with a very good focus. The missiles and rockets that they have deployed into Lebanon is a good example of very successful power projection. But again, it is a matter of looking at each of these capabilities individually. And in a lot of cases, when I use the term spoiler, understand you can't play a spoiler role unless you have a divided, weak, or incoherent opponent. Now, if you were talking about any of the unity that people talk about in the Arab world actually being even moderately effective, a lot of these actions would never have taken place. Mm-hmm. It takes a Lebanon. It takes a Syria. It takes a Yemen. It takes a Bahrain. And is the real threat Iran, or is it self-destructive behavior within each of those countries? And I would say that as long as you have that behavior, Iran will exploit it and use it. What are its ambitions? I don't detect that much difference from the Shah. If there's a vulnerability, they'll exploit it and try to use it. Mm-hmm. This idea that you have defensive and offensive strategies distinguished from defense plus opportunism, I think simply isn't realistic. And I think that we really, I'm trying to think back to the first time that it suddenly occurred to me that Arab is often a subtle synonym for disunity and sometimes for dysfunctional. Now, we're never supposed to say that, but every time I hear anybody talk about an Arab alliance of any kind, it always strikes me as being one of those terms like the international community or regional cooperation. You only hear it when something is going to fail.
Thankfully, you didn't say military intelligence.
Yeah, I was thinking he was going there, but thanks a lot, Dr. Cordesman. Ambassador Winnefeld, we've looked at Iran in the region. We're holding this conference on U.S. policy, U.S. Challenges to U.S. policy here in Washington, D.C. Tell us a bit about how you understand how the U.S. looks at Iran, the threats, challenges, and opportunities for policy formulation.
Okay, thank you. You know, you're the second person to call me Ambassador Winnefeld. The first one was Nancy Pelosi in some sort of a hearing. So thank you. I'm walking on air.
You prefer that to
yeah, as Jerry would say. Thanks for the opportunity to provide a few of my thoughts on Iran. When I think about it, the first thing that comes to my mind is the difference in goals between the United States and Iran, where you have a very ambitious regional power versus a major power that's defending many different global interests all over the place. And there is an asymmetry there that's really important. Where our ambition or our goal might be something noble like a balance of power in the Middle East where everyone plays by the rules and there's no hegemony, there's no terrorism, there's no weapons of mass destruction movement, which is, of course, perhaps not achievable. The other goals, particularly of Iran and other folks in the region, are not only preservation of their regime, as Tony alluded to, but also extending now into economic, political, military, and religious dominance of the region. It's about as pure an example of regional competition as you can find anywhere in the world. Now, my recollection is that chess was actually invented in Iran, and they're very good strategists, I think, within their limitations. They threaten a lot, but they don't always carry out their threats. They will push if not challenged. And just as a personal example, the Shia militias targeting our troops in Iraq, we didn't challenge them on that, so they kept doing it. But they retreat when they miscalculate and are smacked down. And somebody alluded to 1988 when we did Operation Praying Mantis in response to Iranian mining in the Gulf, the Persian Gulf. And they backed off of that. They have no respect for international law. It's pure pragmatism. But they do know when to back down in the face of power. And I'm going to quote a wonderful author named Amin Maalouf, who is a fellow Lebanese, in a beautiful book that he wrote called Samarkand. And this is Princess Shireen, Persian Princess Shireen, talking around the turn of the last century. We should have been patient and waited, used tricks, procrastinated, yielded, told lies, and given promises. That has always been the wisdom of the Orient. And that's about as good an encapsulation of the Iranian approach to the external outside world as I can think of anywhere. So this means that, as Tony did an artful job of describing the regional military balance of power, like most countries, they know they cannot compete symmetrically with the United States. So they choose to compete asymmetrically, and we have to be ready for this. So they're going to continue using threats and actual actions like mining, small boat attacks, cruise missiles, drones, terrorism, holding at risk our people in Iraq, exporting weapons to Houthis and Hezbollah, and mischief in the Gulf states, notably Bahrain, and also ballistic missiles as their sort of asymmetric means that they will probably present more of a threat than an actual in-motion action. They'd love to be able to bloody our nose, but they will only do it if it means they have to tolerate a small loss rather than a large one. So that's their risk calculus. So what do you do? I think the term asymmetric realpolitik is what comes to mind in my view when we approach Iran. We have to remember that we Americans love to have a nice, stable end state, preferably within a 4-year administration, so that credit can be taken for solving the problem. And we have to understand that some problems go back not only decades, but centuries and millennia, and are essentially insolvable to a beautiful realm of stability. So that's where asymmetric realpolitik comes in. It means changing behavior, but not necessarily changing a regime. There is an awful lot of talk being thrown around about regime change. I think we have to resist that. We've proven that we're not very good at that. We're very clumsy when we try to do this, not only in actually affecting the regime change, but most importantly, what comes after. We're just horrible at this, and we can't predict what comes into place after the regime change. But it doesn't mean tolerating what this regime is doing. It means pushing back hard. It means exposing misdeeds. It means clear messaging. It means international consensus, sanctions, consistency in response, but unpredictability necessarily in the type of cost that you impose. And it means not taking counsel of our fears. It may mean new interpretations of international law, and I'll give you one example of that. There's a UN Security Council resolution that prohibits Iran from exporting weapons to anyone. And the only way that Security Council resolution passed was if it did not have an enforcement mechanism, because China and Russia would have vetoed it otherwise. So now you have a rule that somebody can't do something but no way to enforce it. And as we know, most of you who are lawyers can say there are really only 3 ways you're allowed to use force in international arena. One is if you have a UN Security Council resolution that allows you to do it. Another one is if you are doing self-defense, including collective self-defense against an imminent threat. And the third is if another nation invites you in to help them handle some sort of an insurgency or something like that. And so if we're going to, say, prevent an Iran from exporting weapons to people we don't like to have those weapons, then we're going to need to be more creative about what self-defense really is and what imminent really is, and to get some help from our partners to ask for that kind of help, and to be willing to step a little bit into the gray zone of international law in pushing back. I will mention a couple of military things. I'm not going to repeat what Tony said. Just a terrific, although severe, rundown of regional militaries. I don't think they're that bad. I mean, Jim Mattis will call the UAE little Sparta. But I will read you a quote about Iran's military. Again, this is a wonderful author named V.S. Naipaul, who wrote a book, Among the Believers. And V.S. Naipaul was sitting on the tarmac in, I thought it was Bandar Abbas, but I recently read that it was in Tehran. And he's looking out the window of his airliner, and he sees a couple of F-4 Phantoms take off. And this is during the Iran-Iraq War. And he says, later I learned the 2 Phantoms had crashed, and that the news was curiously sickening. Such trim and deadly aircraft, so vulnerable the inadequately trained men within, half victims, yet that morning obedient to the will of God and the 12th Imam and full of murder. And I think that's a pretty good encapsulation of where the Iranian military is, and we can get into more detail there. And I'll close by just giving you what I think are a few imperatives, because I was asked to talk about U.S. military imperatives in that. And I think the first one is to make sure that we are very closely synchronized in our actions with the other elements of U.S. national power and with allied and partner power in the region, to include, as I think, again, Tony alluded to, enhancing their true capabilities, not just the things that they're buying, but their ability to use them effectively. We also need to maintain our readiness in light of what I think was actually a decent nuclear agreement. It had some flaws, but we need to maintain our readiness to take out the Iranian nuclear program physically and make sure they understand that we can do that so that we don't have to. We need to be very, very clear in our messaging to Iran so that any action against U.S. interests will face that it will face a firm and proportional response, and then to back that up when it happens. And in that regard, I think, if you look way back to our presence in Iraq, had we taken some kind of kinetic small action against an Iranian interest and messaged them quietly that this is because your Shia militias in Iraq are targeting our people, they would have stopped. I'm convinced of that. We need to continue initiatives that will deny their asymmetric capabilities against U.S. assets and partners in the region. What does that mean? Continuing to grow our ability to counter their small boat and UAV attacks. Willingness to counter attacks against our personnel in Iraq, as I described a moment ago. Principled support for partners counting Iranian surrogates in Yemen and elsewhere. Ballistic missile defenses, getting a little bit better regional networking there, and also continuing to advance our own capabilities, because we're losing the battle on the cost curve there of expensive missiles shooting down inexpensive missiles, and there are some things we can be doing there. We need, as I mentioned earlier, be more creative in applying international law. Don't get trapped in an asymmetric conflict with them. I'd hate to see an aircraft carrier get trapped in the Arabian Gulf. We need to be wary of that. We need to be unpredictable also. We tend to have this 1.0 carrier presence all the time, which is exhausting and very predictable. I would rather see us with 2.0 sometimes and then sometimes nothing. And the Iranians won't know when that's either one of those things is happening. And we also need to make sure we don't exhaust ourselves. We've got an awful lot of force over there. When it looked a few years ago, everybody was nervous about Israel attacking Iran's nuclear program, and Central Command successfully argued to have 2 aircraft carriers in the Gulf. We sustained that longer than we should have, and it really wore us down. And so we have to just be very careful and measured in how we present them with military presence. And then we just have to be careful not to overreact. We have to maintain our own discipline in our rules of engagement. For example, when a little Iranian small boat harasses a U.S. ship, big whoop. If you really take some kind of really aggressive action against this, then we will respond in accordance with the rules of engagement. Let's make sure we don't start something unnecessarily. I think what this really means is maintenance of a very hard pushback against Iran, but not so much that we create unnecessarily conflict in the region or go down the road of what we did in 1953 and a number of other mistakes that I think we've made. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Admiral. Thank you very much. We have 20 minutes remaining, so I want to go straight to audience questions. I believe there are microphones roaming about. Let's start with the gentleman in the back. Your name and a quick question. We'll take a few questions and then to the panel.
My name is Ali Dad Mafinez. I'm West Asia Council. My question for the panel has to do with the fact that in Iran's threat perception, the one country that could actually invade it, the one country that could actually undermine its regime is the United States. It's not Saudi Arabia, much less UAE or Qatar wanting to invade Iran. It is the United States. How could we take that out of the equation somewhat so that they lower their guards, so that maybe a different type of engagement and relationship might be possible in the future? Thank you.
Thank you, Ali. Other questions, comments? Lady here. Microphone's coming to you. Go ahead, Laurie.
Laurie Milroy, Kurdistan 24. I was very interested in Dr. Maloney's comment about ties between Russia and Iran. And I'd be interested in her or anyone else expanding on that, why they exist, and why aren't the Iranians concerned, since there's been a historical Russian encroachment on Iranian territory, don't they seem to be concerned about that now?
Thank you, Laurie. Barbara? Lady in third row.
Thanks, Barbara Sullivan from the Atlantic Council. Admiral Winnefeld, it was nice to hear your comments on regime change, especially as the State Department has just released some new documents on the topic of the 53 coup. But actually my question was about your mention of Iraq and not pushing back against the Iranians for the activities of their special groups and militias. If my memory serves, the U.S. picked up 5 Quds Force members in Kurdistan and held them for several years as essentially hostages, as a way to pay the Iranians back. And I just wondered why you thought that was not sufficient retaliation for what they were doing. I think the attacks on Americans stopped after that.
Thank you, Barbara. And the gentleman in the third row.
Hi, my name is Sheikh Itiri. I'm an Iranian student from Arizona State, and thank you very much for being here. Thank you, Admiral, for your distinguished service. My question is that Dr. Cordesman elaborated on why Iran is an overinflated tiger. However, Iran has some advantages. For example, it has the second highest population in the region. It has an ideological aspect which empowers, in case of an conventional war, it's the only country in the region with senior military leaders who have fought in conventional wars and has some experience on asymmetric wars. And finally, it has an advantage of nationalism/patriotism only matched by Israel in the region. So and I ask this as a proponent of hard power. How can we use soft power to weaken the regime domestically, at least the psychological aspects like ideology and the legitimacy that the regime has? For example, Mr. McInnes is here. We had at AEI there was a poll that showed one out of each 5 persons supported a version of rule by the jurist, which means at least 5 in each 5 person accepts the legitimacy. How can we weaken these aspects?
Thank you. Another question in that round? Yes, sir.
Yes, Beirut Arabi, I'm a member, Middle East Institute member. Just a comment and a question. The comment, actually chess was not invented in Iran, it was invented in India. The game that was invented in Iran was backgammon. And that has an element of probability and chance that kind of ties nicely into the cultural views that you usually see in Iran. Anyway, so the question that I have is, so we have a certain characterization of Iranians as, tricky and this and that and the other, Princess Shireen and this and that. They all go back to, we have examples of that going back to Haji Baba Isfahan in the 19th century that provide an image of Iranians as very tricky people who cannot be trusted and this and that. My question is, over the last 20 or 30 years that we've been dealing with Iran, what are some of the examples of them negotiating and agreeing and signing an agreement with them, and then they go back off on that and not meeting their obligations legally through the international mechanisms that are available there?
Thank you. Let's go to our panel. Let me start left to right if you want to react to any of the questions. Tony?
Very quickly, I think that Iran's current concern with a U.S. invasion is far more limited than it was after 2003, 2004. For 2 reasons. One, I think that we have seen, and they have seen us see, that invasions don't always quite work out exactly as well as you plan, that they can be extraordinarily messy, extended. And I think also it was always questionable, as Iraq found out. You don't invade Iran from the coastline unless you wish to have the equivalent of a logistic and operational nightmare. It's a little difficult to invade Iran successfully from Kuwait. And it is rather difficult to invade it from Iraq unless you have created a massive capability to do it. I think where they are concerned and where we simply cannot alter the structure is we have an immense precision strike capability. We have immense naval superiority and air superiority. We can send in highly focused special forces and other missions where the opportunity exists in ways they can't always predict. And we obviously have, and this is at the far margin, a major nuclear superiority. And these are capabilities where I think they watch what we do elsewhere and see the superiority that the US military can provide. And here I should also again say, because I may not have made it clear listening to Admiral Winnefeld, there are some really good elements of Arab Gulf forces, particularly in the air. And when it comes down to offensive air missions for conventional war or particular strikes, they have considerable capability. Iran and Russia, I think we need to remember that Russia has played Iran very well as an arms supplier now, basically since the Iran-Iraq War, always carefully rationing its arms, but keeping up relationships. We don't know where this is going, whether they'll provide larger supplies, but they certainly are the wild card, if there is one, in terms of rapid arms support, if they ever did have access to arms imports. I really find it hard to worry too much about pushback in Iraq. I think Barbara is right, and so is the Admiral. Quite frankly, it depended on which moment in time in which set of problems we were dealing with. And we perhaps haven't been as good at some moments as we have at others. I'm going to have to say that in an era of modern high-tech war, I find the descriptions of relative morale and ideological motivation to be, shall we say, somewhat uncertain, but they also are largely irrelevant. You are talking not about mass armies fighting on the ground, you're talking about technological ability to actually implement strikes coherently and effectively and relative vulnerability. Beyond that, I think I will defer to my colleagues.
Thank you. Admiral?
Okay, very good questions. Thank you from the audience. I don't know if I'll remember all of them, but I'll certainly try to touch each of them briefly. Trying to persuade an Iranian that the U.S. is not interested in invading their country is a bit like trying to persuade the Russians that missile defense is not about them. In both cases, very, very foolish for the U.S. to consider trying to do either one of those things. And I can't imagine a U.S. interest that would be so threatened that would cause us to execute a ground invasion of Iran to overthrow the regime. Notwithstanding the difficulty, the cost in blood and treasure vis-a-vis that interest, it's just about the dumbest thing we can do. And I think Bob Gates was very smart in saying anybody who wants to do a land war on Asia, including South Asia in this case, ought to have their head examined. But try to convince an Iranian of that, and I think Tony's probably right. Maybe they're a little bit less anxious about that than they used to be. I think you just have to keep telling them, look, we're just not interested in doing that. But I also agree with Tony in that we have considerable capabilities that can impose costs on them for behavior that is proportionate, as it should be under international law, that pushes back firmly when they violate international law or threaten our interests in a way that makes it appropriate under international law that we would respond. So we have to hold some things that they have at risk, but a ground invasion would be absolutely nuts. In terms of written agreements, very good question. I don't know an awful lot of written agreements that Iran has made with the, I hate to use the term international community, pardon me, Tony. We do know that it seems like they're adhering to the JICPOA reasonably well. I think it's in their interest to do that. They don't want to go back to sanctions, a snapback. If you view a nation's obligations as a member of the United Nations to adhere to UN Security Council resolutions, then they are in violation of those, clearly in violation of numerous UN Security Council resolutions. So I think that it's safe to say that they are a little bit untrustworthy in that regard. And I didn't mean my comments to imply that Iranians are that way. I meant it to imply that the Iranian government, the regime, and I would say maybe the Shah too, for all I know. Tony makes a good point there. But I don't have any sort of ethnic problem with many of my friends who are Iranians. In terms of hostages, very good good question on that. You know, we did capture a couple of their guys. We would never use the term and never did use the term hostages. They broke the law. They were responsible for the deaths of American soldiers. Well, then that government official was misguided and should have been held accountable for that. Frankly, we don't do hostages. But candidly, and I don't know that the attacks totally ceased then. I take your point. It's a good point. I am convinced, though, that it would have been necessary and proportional and in self-defense if we were to take out, and under the Obama administration, it would have done without any casualties, you know, that sort of thing. Take out something important to the Iranians, and then you message them through the Oman regimes like, hey, knock it off. Okay, so I think there was a dispute there. The question of soft power is a really interesting one, and this gets to the elusive Iranian moderate, if I can once again quote Bob Gates. You know, there really is a struggle going on inside Iran. Iran, as many of you know better than I do, is an immensely complex government and an immensely complex society. And if you look at the hardliners as mostly what I call the 79ers, you know, the revolutionaries and the Iraq War veterans, an older generation, and if the moderates, if they can be called that, are mostly a younger generation, I still think that even the Green Revolution folks would push back very hard on a U.S. intervention. So I think the best you can do is to try to reward whatever moderate behavior comes out of Iran with soft power, while holding whatever illegal or extremist or behavior against our interests with, if necessary, hard power, but definitely with all instruments of U.S. power. I think you have to keep that balance. And this is a long-term deal. It's not we're going to solve this in 4 years and take credit for it.
Thank you, Admiral. Suzanne?
Quickly, let me try to add something to the great responses that have already been given to the questions. In terms of the first question, which I took not so much about an invasion, but about this question of how Washington can or should be trying to change Iran's threat perception, I agree with Admiral Winnefeld that this is simply inconceivable. You know, there's been an incredible consistency from Ayatollah Khamenei in particular, but others within the security establishment about the way that they view American intentions that has endured through very different conceptualizations of America's approach to Iran. And those changes, the differences in the way that, say, Obama versus Trump or Obama versus Bush sought to position the United States toward Tehran really had zero impact on the way that Iran perceived the threat to emanate from Washington. So I think in terms of the kind of existential fear that Iran has of the United States, that's incumbent upon Iranians to change, not incumbent upon Americans to change. And it gets to the question about soft power, because you know what people, especially in this environment, often overlook is that many in Iran saw Obama as more threatening to the Islamic Republic than you know, the sort of bluster of Trump or even the kind of talk of military intervention in the early days of the Bush administration. That what Obama presented was the soft power threat, the cultural invasion, the possibility of American tourists and even potentially future businessmen coming and taking root within Iran, and that would corrupt the revolution from within. Look, I don't think that this is an American government strategy, and I think that ultimately, in terms of soft power, we have an incredible deficit when it comes to the Islamic Republic. Look at 53, for example, in which the Iranians have, you know, cultivated this cult of Mossadegh, without ever mentioning his name, without ever sort of lionizing the man himself. They've focused on the sort of essential untrustworthiness of the American role, even as they have denigrated, you know, the kind of secular nationalism that Mossadegh stood for. So, you know, they're just much better at messaging their own population for obvious reasons. They have a considerable advantage in terms of information dominance within Iran as compared to anyone else. And so I think you know, while it's an important conversation to have, I think we have to go into it with this expectation that you know, there's no sort of psyops from Washington that's going to you know, weaken the regime from within effectively. It's incumbent upon Iranians. I'll speak very quickly to the Russia relationship because I think it is important and obviously somewhat controversial even within Iranian circles, given the long history and the historical memories of the Russian acquisitiveness in terms of Iranian territory, but also in terms of Russian unreliability in terms of defending Iranian interests throughout the nuclear crisis, for example. I can only interpret the increasing and significant cooperation on Syria in a way as a sort of recognition on the part of the Iranians that we are no longer purely in a sole superpower world, and that maintaining options and developing relationships with Russia as well as with China are going to be important to its own maneuverability in the region. And just finally, in terms of the Paris, in terms of the question of whether or not Iran has ever reneged on an international agreement, I guess I'd point to the 2003 Asad-Abad and then the Paris Accord. I mean, Iran explicitly abrogated the agreement with the EU3 to suspend enrichment, and that obviously escalated the nuclear crisis. That was a decision that was not taken by a single individual. It had across-the-board political consensus from within Iran. And it was done with a recognition that there would be consequences in terms of driving this crisis to the UN Security Council and potentially producing the very sanctions and international pressure that resulted. So I think that there is, we have to go into any kind of negotiation with the Iranians with the recognition that there may come a time at which the leadership decides that it's worthwhile to walk away from a deal. That the potential benefits outside of the agreement are preferable to the limited benefits within the agreement.
Thank you, Dr. Maloney. This really has been a very rich and nuanced introduction to the whole topic. And I want to thank all of our panelists. Before doing so, just in terms of the process, I understand that Senator Coons has now arrived, so we're going to, after concluding the session, set up that session. I would ask you to stay in your seats so we can do this quickly and get started. But please join me in thanking our panel, Dr. Maloney, Ambassador Winnefeld, and Dr. Cordesman. Thank you very much.